One June morning in the year 793, the island of Lindisfarne breathed the same ritual calm that had marked over a century of monastic life. The northeast wind arrived softly, carrying the scent of the sea, and the bells of the monastery of St. Cuthbert called the monks and nuns to their morning prayers. For them, everything began like any other day. The murmur of psalms, the rustling of manuscripts in the scriptorium, the slow rhythm of the fields where the earth obeyed peaceful hands. It was a small, closed world built on faith, silence, and discipline, a world that believed itself protected by divine presence. But that morning held something different, something no believing heart was prepared to interpret. Before the sun had fully risen, a dark line appeared on the horizon. At first it seemed like a shapeless shadow, as if the sea itself had decided to rise up to observe the humans. Then, that shadow lengthened, multiplied, and took the shape of sails pulled taut by an unknown wind. They were not merchant ships, nor local fishermen returning early. They were long, sharp silhouettes, made of dark wood and crowned by prows that looked like mythological creatures. Drakars. The monks at first thought it might be a trick of the eye, an illusion caused by the mist that sometimes played on the coast. But as the vessels drew closer, the spiritual silence they so revered was replaced by a different silence, a heavy, expectant silence, as if the sky were holding its breath. At that time, it was not unusual for any natural phenomenon to be interpreted as an omen. Had they not seen sudden hurricanes, lightning without storms, and inexplicable lights crossing the night? And now before them, the line between the sacred and the profane was beginning to blur. The ships advanced unhurriedly, like predators that know their prey cannot escape. The religious communities, oblivious to the military world, had no fortifications, no warriors, not even weapons beyond agricultural tools. The island, which had always been a refuge, seemed in that instant like an offering left in the hands of fate. And although no one said anything yet, everyone understood that this presence was not friendly. There was a coldness in the air, a sensation that crawled across the skin like a warning the mind did not yet know how to formulate. As the sails brought the shadows closer to the coast, a silent question began to grow in many hearts. Why now? Why here, in a place of peace? What had caused a sacred corner to become the target of unknown forces? No one knew, but fear answered before reason. Some monks looked to the sky as if searching for a sign. Others clutched their crucifixes with trembling hands. And in that mixture of faith and terror, another darker question began to insinuate itself. Was this the punishment for a hidden sin? Or simply the test that no soul expected to face? The dawn no longer illuminated the island. It eclipsed it. The sound of the sea, so familiar, now seemed an unsettling murmur, almost a whisper warning of something inevitable. The Drakars did not stop. They continued their advance, unbothered, confident, as if they perfectly knew the value of the place they were heading to. And with every meter, the island lost a little more of its innocence. In a few hours, everything would change. The prayers that had begun at dawn no longer asked for blessings, but for answers. And as the shadows from the north glided toward the mainland, a bitter certainty began to settle over everyone. There were dawns that did not bring light, but history. And history was about to turn its gaze toward Lindisfarne. To understand why those ships reached Lindisfarne and why a sacred place became prey, we must look beyond the horizon toward the vast world that was being born in Northern Europe. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, what we now call the Viking Age was not simply an explosion of attacks. It was the result of a complex web of social, technological, and spiritual transformations that pushed thousands of men to leave their lands and sail into the unknown. Scandinavia at that time was not a unified territory. It consisted of isolated communities, led by chieftains seeking prestige, wealth, and recognition. The land was harsh, the climate unpredictable, and the population was growing faster than the resources could sustain. In that world, strength was not just a virtue, it was a necessity. Whoever did not advance fell behind, and whoever did not gain honor disappeared into oblivion. For a Norse warrior, Returning home empty-handed was a disgrace worse than death itself. It was then that an innovation changed everything. The dracars. With flexible keels, light hulls, and unprecedented maneuverability, these ships could navigate oceans, rivers, and narrow coastlines without difficulty. They were silent when they needed to be, swift when the wind favored them, and capable of transporting dozens of men on journeys that no other people dared to undertake. Those ships were not mere vessels. They were a symbol of power, a strategic weapon, a bridge between worlds that should never have crossed paths. And above all, they were a promise of wealth, renown, and glory. In this context, Christian monasteries became irresistible targets. To a Viking, they were not sacred temples, but unlocked safes. For generations, the faithful had donated gold, silver, chalices, reliquaries, and manuscripts richly decorated with precious metal leaf. That accumulation was not defended by soldiers, but by men and women who had renounced violence. From the Norse perspective, practical, raw, ruthless, that was a contradiction, a treasure without a guardian. And yet there was something deeper, something that Christian chroniclers sensed but never fully stated. For warrior peoples, striking a foreign sanctuary was also a symbolic declaration, a message, a reminder that no belief, no altar, no matter how sacred, was beyond the reach of the human world. It was a cultural clash, a clash of worldviews where faith in God confronted faith in strength. The most ironic thing is that this dynamic, thousands of years later, continues to repeat itself in the modern world. Religious buildings looted, temples destroyed in times of conflict, spiritual centers turned into arenas of dispute. Places of prayer, regardless of the era, have always been vulnerable, perhaps because they represent something that violence wants to deny, that there are corners where power should not enter. For the Vikings, every successful raid was a stepping stone to a higher status. A man who returned with loot became someone worthy of tales, worthy of banquets, worthy of an honorable tomb. That is why attacking Lindisfarne was not an accident. It was a calculated operation. It was isolated, wealthy, and defenseless. It was the perfect prey in a sea full of predators. Thus, as the dracars advanced toward the mainland, they were not driven by the irrational fury described in Christian chronicles, but by a cold and ancient logic, the pursuit of prosperity in a merciless world. For them, violence was not evil, but economics. It was not sacrilege, but strategy. And Lindisfarne, on that dawn in 793, was about to learn this in the most painful way. Because when a people who live for steel encounter another who live for prayer, history always remembers who had the wind in their favor. The first sign was not a scream, nor a blow, nor even the sound of metal that would soon mark the island's fate. It was the silence, a strange, thick, almost physical silence, a silence that fell suddenly over the monastery, as if the world had held its breath. The monks and nuns working in the fields looked up at the same time. Something was moving beyond the rocks, something that did not belong to the holy routine of Lindisfarne. The dracars touched the coast with an unsettling gentleness, as if the waters themselves were making way for them. The inhabitants of the monastery, without weapons, without training, and without any real understanding of the danger, took a few steps forward, trying to make out whether this was human or an omen. History in those seconds began to compress before exploding. When the first men descended from the vessels, the air filled with a tension that the human mind only experiences when it realizes, too late, that there is nowhere to run. There were no walls, no reinforced doors, no soldiers, only sacred walls, ancient writings, and a faith that in that instant felt as fragile as the paper of the illuminated manuscripts. The attack did not present itself immediately with a roar. It arrived like an unfolding shadow, like an eclipse advancing unhurriedly. The monks heard heavy footsteps on the gravel, voices in a language that no ear trained in Latin had ever heard, and the dull, metallic clanking of objects striking against other objects. The Vikings did not need to raise their voices. Their mere presence filled the world. For the religious, this was the intrusion of a reality they had never imagined possible. Some clung to a cross, murmuring prayers that unraveled in the wind. Others instinctively backed away toward the church as if the walls could protect them. Some tried to speak, perhaps to negotiate, perhaps to buy time, but the distance between the two cultures was a chasm without a bridge. For the first time, many of them understood that holiness was not enough to stop the world. The objects that had been accumulated over centuries, the reliquaries containing sacred fragments, the gold chalices, the embroidered vestments, everything the faithful had given as an act of devotion became, in an instant, what the invaders desired most. The Vikings did not see the sacred aura of those treasures. They saw metal that could be melted down, traded, turned into tangible wealth. The spirituality of some was the economy of others. The resistance was minimal, almost symbolic. But even that desperate action left a bitter feeling, a mixture of helplessness and disbelief. Not because the religious men were weak, but because they had never been prepared for the harshness of the outside world. Their battle was spiritual, not physical, and that day was not a battle, but a rupture, a fracture between two ways of understanding existence. The nuns were the first to understand that something irreparable was about to happen, not through an explicit act, but through the way the invaders looked at them, as if they were part of the loot. The heartbreaking realization that their lives no longer belonged to them was born in them before any order was given. Some tried to hide in the cloisters, others knelt in prayer. None knew what fate awaited them, but they sensed that nothing would ever be the same again. In a matter of minutes, the monastery became a place that no longer served its original purpose. Prayers hung suspended in the air, manuscripts mingled with dust and fear, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed where only Gregorian chant had once reigned. It was as if the island itself had changed owners. A consecrated territory forcefully torn from the divine order to be claimed by the most brutal human will. Some monks and nuns were pulled aside, others ignored, others dragged away. But all of them, even those left lying on the ground unable to move, felt the same coal-black truth. The world they knew had ended, and from then on their history would no longer be written by them, but by those who considered them part of the spoils. When the smoke began to rise from the sacred buildings, it was not just wood burning. It was the end of an era, of an innocence that would never return. Lindisfarne had not only been destroyed physically, its spirit had been broken, and that silent break would echo for centuries. To understand what awaited the captives of Lindisfarne, especially those who would be taken far from their homeland, we must look inside one of the harshest and most structured social systems of medieval Europe: Norse slavery. It was not a temporary punishment, nor a negotiated servitude. It was a definitive descent into a world where a person's name, will, and faith could be erased as if they had never existed. In Viking society, the hierarchy was strict. At the top were the jarls, nobles who controlled lands, resources, and trade networks. Then came the carls, free men who worked, traded, and fought. And at the lowest limit, almost invisible to history, were the thrall, slaves. For the Norsemen, slavery was not immoral. It was an accepted economic mechanism, an essential cog that sustained daily life. In a world where the climate was cruel, where physical labor was exhausting, and where every winter could mean death, having unfree labor was equivalent to surviving. Slaves came from multiple origins: prisoners of war, people in debt, condemned criminals, and of course, victims of raids like the one on Lindisfarne. In the eyes of a Viking, a monk or a nun was not sacred. They were useful bodies. Workforce, resources. That functional dehumanization was what allowed the captors to move forward without remorse, even after a devastating attack. Slave markets thrived in trading hubs like Ribe, Hedeby, or Dublin. There, captives were examined as if they were beasts of burden. Merchants evaluated their age, physical endurance, and docility. In the case of the religious, there was also an added factor. Many believed that Christians were disciplined workers, accustomed to obedience and communal life. For a Norse master, that was an advantage. The spiritual world that had given meaning to their lives ironically became the reason they would be considered valuable in a market that understood nothing of souls. But the darkest aspect of the system was not in the buying and selling, but in the inner transformation. For a slave, the first blow was not physical, but psychological, discovering that they no longer belonged to themselves. Monks who had dedicated their lives to prayer and study suddenly found themselves on farms where the day began with the cold biting their fingers and ended with an exhausted body with no right to complain. Nuns accustomed to a routine of contemplation, silence, and strict rules were thrown into an environment where no one respected their calling or their spiritual identity. The change was not just cultural, it was existential. Everything they had been became irrelevant. Viking discipline toward their slaves varied depending on the master. Some were pragmatic. A useful slave had to be kept alive and relatively healthy. Others exercised their authority harshly, using physical punishment as a regular tool. Norse law, centuries later, recorded these practices without disguise. A slave had no rights. They could not go to court. They could not defend themselves. They could not refuse. Their body and their life were an extension of their owner's will. For the newly captured, this reality was almost unimaginable. They came from monasteries where authority was strict, yes, but it was also framed by spiritual rules, by a common purpose, by a shared moral vision. In contrast, the Norse world saw order as a chain where the lowest link had to accept its position without question. And if a slave tried to flee, the geography itself became their enemy. Unknown forests, inhospitable mountains, incomprehensible languages, villages where any foreigner could be identified immediately. All this meant that slavery in the North was not just an economic system, but a maze with no way out. A maze where identity thinned day by day until it became a shadow. The monks and nuns of Lindisfarne, upon being taken from their land, did not just lose their freedom, they lost their world. What awaited them was not a second life, but a suspended existence where time ran on with no hope of return. And even so, the greatest tragedy was not in the hard labor or the loss of autonomy. It was in the silence, an inner silence that began the day they were separated from everything that gave them meaning. A silence they could not break because no one would listen. A silence that, over time, became part of them. In the Norse system, slaves were destined to leave no trace, and yet their invisible lives sustained empires, farms, expeditions, and homes. They were the mute pillars of a society that preferred not to look down. And as the ships sailed away from Lindisfarne, the captives did not know it yet, but they were entering a world where their voices would be erased before they could utter a single word. For the consecrated women captured at Lindisfarne, the journey north was not just a physical voyage, it was the most profound rupture a religious life could endure. There was no visible blow, but there was an inner breaking that began the instant their feet left the sacred ground where they had taken eternal vows. For decades, their identities had been forged around silence, discipline, prayer, and sacrifice. Their existence had been a thread woven between them and heaven. But now that thread was stretched to the breaking point. In Christian monasteries, a nun was not simply a woman. She was a symbol. She represented purity, dedication, and a voluntary renunciation of worldly desires. She had surrendered her body and soul to a spiritual ideal. However, to the men who captured her, none of that mattered. They did not understand the monastic cell, they did not comprehend the liturgy, and much less did they appreciate the theological value of chastity. They saw a potential worker, someone who could serve in the house, in the fields, in the workshops. Her calling became irrelevant in the face of the demands of a system that did not recognize the sacred. For them, the transition was total disorientation. They had lived in communities where every day began with bells and prayer, where every gesture had a religious meaning. Now, on the ships sailing unknown seas, the sound of the waves replaced the chants, and the harsh voices of the warriors substituted the ritual peace. Every minute on board was a silent confirmation that the world they knew had disappeared. The cultural shock could not have been more violent internally. They were accustomed to obedience, yes, but to an obedience felt as part of a higher purpose. In contrast, the service now imposed on them had no transcendent meaning. It was a naked obedience, without spiritual comfort, without divine promise. The tasks they once did out of devotion, washing, sewing, cooking, would now be imposed as an absolute obligation, without gratitude or recognition. Even discipline, which was once chosen, became a strange burden imposed from the outside. The geography itself became a form of emotional punishment. Upon arriving in Norse lands, they discovered a landscape that seemed devoid of any familiar symbol. Craggy mountains, endless forests, a cold that pierced the skin as if trying to expel any memory of their past life. Everything was new. Everything was hostile. Even the homes where they would end up serving were filled with objects, rituals, and words whose meaning they could not understand. What was everyday life for the Vikings was an unintelligible world to them. But the most devastating thing was the loss of identity. In the monastery, each had a religious name, a spiritual history, a mission. In Norse society, all of that unraveled. Now they were valued for their usefulness, not for their souls. They were anonymous, replaceable, invisible. They had gone from being daughters of God to being human property. And that transformation could not be expressed in words because language was yet another barrier. They could not pray aloud without being misunderstood. They could not explain their pain. They could not beg for mercy. For some, the deepest feeling was not fear, but guilt. The guilt of no longer being able to live according to their vows. The guilt of having been separated from their community and their purpose. The guilt, irrational but powerful, of believing they were failing God. In the medieval mindset, the body was the temple of the spirit. Seeing that temple reduced to a tool, seeing their spiritual freedom crushed by a system that knew no divine limits, was a wound more painful than any physical punishment. And yet, in the midst of the darkness, a small spark emerged that tied them to their former lives, their ability to resist in silence. They could not master the language or the culture, but they could remember. Remember the psalms, the night prayers, the feeling of walking through the cloisters when the light filtering through the stones seemed like a blessing. That memory was their inner refuge, a small sanctuary that no one could take from them. Even so, the reality remained inexorable. Their lives had been torn up by the roots. There would be no easy return. There would be no automatic restoration of what was lost. Like pages torn from a sacred book, their existence would be rewritten with someone else's ink, in a language they never asked to learn. And as the northern winters approached, each of them understood deep down a bitter truth. The world had not only torn them from their faith, it was also forcing them to survive without it. The daily life of captives in Nordic lands was governed by a simple and brutal logic: serve, endure, and disappear into the routine of work. There was no room for identity, nor for the past, nor for the hope of returning. What awaited the captured monks and nuns was not visible torture, which the laws of the time would have recorded with horror, but something more silent and corrosive, an existence reduced to chores, orders, and exhaustion. There, in that frozen world where the sun seemed to battle the darkness for half the year, time became a chain as heavy as any shackle. On a Viking farm, life followed a relentless cycle. The day began before dawn, with the cold piercing the skin like invisible needles. Slaves were the first to rise and the last to rest. The nuns who previously began their mornings with gentle prayers and contemplative rituals now had to light hearths, grind grain with heavy stones, carry water from frozen rivers, and prepare food for a family that considered them instruments rather than people. Spiritual discipline had been replaced by a physical discipline without respite. The monks fared no better. Some were assigned to agricultural work, chopping wood, repairing roofs, plowing the hardened earth, transporting goods. Others served in artisan workshops where they learned to work metal, wood, or leather. The most bitter irony was that those who had spent their lives copying manuscripts in silence, tending medicinal gardens, or studying theology now had to hold tools they had never touched. The knowledge they had accumulated over years, Latin, liturgy, philosophy, held no value whatsoever in a household where the only thing that mattered was immediate utility. Treatment depended entirely on the master's personality. Some were pragmatic. Keeping a slave alive meant preserving a useful investment. But others exercised their authority relentlessly. In a society where strength was the language of prestige, Demonstrating absolute control over the weakest was part of the social order. And the slaves, without rights, without a voice, and without legal protection, became silent receptacles of that power. A punishment could be as simple as a day without food, or as subtle as an absurd order demanding total obedience. It was not open violence that destroyed the captives, but the daily repetition of acts reminding them that their will had ceased to exist. Attempting to escape was almost unthinkable. The northern geography was a labyrinth of ice, mountains, and endless forests. The climate punished anyone wandering without shelter, and the language was an impossible wall to cross in a few weeks or months. A foreigner was detected in seconds, by their clothing, their features, their accent, their lost gaze. There were no friendly monasteries to take refuge in, nor Christian villages to ask for help. The entire world seemed to have transformed into an alien and hostile island. In the midst of this suffocating reality, thoughts arose that were not written in any chronicle. What happens to a person when they have nothing left? What happens to faith when even praying feels useless? What part of the spirit breaks first, hope or the sense of identity? For many captives, the struggle was not against a violent master, but against a kind of internal emptiness that grew day by day, a space where there was once purpose and now there was only silence. That silence was, perhaps, the deepest form of suffering. The nuns who had lived surrounded by sacred chants, liturgical readings, and the constant company of other sisters now worked in solitude, without comprehensible words, without familiar rites, without the compassionate gaze of someone who shared their spiritual world. The monks, accustomed to communal life, to religious fraternity, found themselves emotionally isolated in an environment where no one understood their habits or their worldview. In some households, however, an unexpected phenomenon began to emerge. Over time, certain masters, especially older women or families who valued loyalty, began to recognize in the slaves a steadfastness, a silent serenity, an ability to work without complaint that agricultural societies deeply appreciated. Although they could not call it respect, it was indeed a form of practical recognition. Some slaves obtained small liberties, resting a little longer, receiving less meager food portions, or working on lighter tasks. It was not kindness, but convenience. But in a world where suffering was a daily occurrence, those crumbs could feel like rays of light in a wall of darkness. And even so, the reality remained the same. The captives lived in a suspended space, a nameless existence. They were shadows moving through the snow, hands working tirelessly, voices that could not fully articulate their pain. Their resistance was invisible, their suffering silent, and their fate uncertain. In Nordic history, slaves are almost always footnotes, brief mentions, presences without identity. But without them, nothing the Vikings achieved would have been possible. They were the forgotten foundations of a society that prospered thanks to their labor. And as the winters fell one after another, the monks and nuns torn from Lindisfarne began to understand that their previous life was not only far away, but that perhaps it no longer existed. As the months, and for some, the years passed, something occurred that none of the medieval chronicles clearly recount, but which the silent history of the captives reveals as an undeniable truth: forced integration. Not an integration that was chosen, celebrated, or understood, but an instinctive, almost animalistic adaptation to a world that offered no alternatives. For many of those captured at Lindisfarne, life in Nordic lands ceased to be a transition and gradually became the only possible reality. The most surprising thing is that this integration did not begin with acceptance, but with exhaustion. Physical fatigue, coupled with culture shock and absolute loneliness, wore down emotional resistance. When the body could no longer fight its fate, the mind began to create survival mechanisms. One of them was learning. Without teachers, without books, without intention, the captives began to absorb the Norse language by listening to orders, insults, scoldings, and domestic conversations. Every understood word was a weapon for survival, every learned gesture, a way to avoid punishment or tension. It was a kind of literacy of suffering, where vocabulary was not learned with ink, but out of necessity. The nuns especially faced a very different inner transformation. In their former monasteries, life was full of symbols and rituals. Here, however, Norse rituals held a meaning that was incomprehensible to them. Celebrations, funerals, banquets, sacrifices, it all seemed like an inverted liturgy, a pagan shadow of what they had known. And yet they had to witness it, serve it, sustain it. They could not look away even if their souls screamed in silence. But even amidst the deepest spiritual shock, unexpected bonds emerged. A child asking for help, tying their shoes. An old woman teaching how to prepare medicinal herbs. A woman sharing a piece of warm bread in the dead of winter. They were minimal, almost invisible gestures, but enough to remind a captive that, even in a cruel world, human beings could recognize the pain of others. Some nuns responded to these moments with a calm that surprised their masters. The same serenity they had cultivated during years of contemplative life now became a form of practical strength. They could not preach, but they could convey peace through their gestures. And that peace, at times, softened the gaze of those around them. The monks, for their part, were often valued for skills that, although useless in combat, proved useful in daily life. They knew how to write, they knew how to read, they knew how to count. Some ended up managing small record-keeping tasks for their owners, keeping simple inventories, or teaching the family's children to recognize Latin letters, even if these symbols represented nothing spiritual to the Norsemen. Thus arose a strange kind of dependency. Master and slave united not by affection, but by necessity. And at that point, the boundary between enemy and servant began to blur. However, this integration came at a devastating emotional price. The more time they spent in Nordic lands, the further they drifted from their own spiritual identity. The psalms they once murmured with fervor now became timid whispers repeated before sleep, like a distant reminder of their true home. Prayers lost their strength, Latin tangled on the tongue, rusting away, and the memory of Lindisfarne, its walls, its gardens, its bells, began to fade, as if it were a dream difficult to reconstruct. In the endless winters when the wind battered the wooden walls and darkness reigned for almost a full day, many captives experienced a kind of inner isolation that not even faith could completely dispel. Who were they now? Were they monks and nuns disguised as forced laborers? Were they shadows of their former selves? Or were they destined to become, sooner or later, part of the world that had torn them from their calling? The answer to these questions was never clear. It was a nebulous emotional territory, a suspension bridge between two identities that would never fully reconcile. Even so, some captives achieved something unexpected, breaking the barrier of hatred. Not because they forgave their captors, but because daily coexistence reveals truths that initial violence had hidden. They discovered that the Vikings were not mythological monsters, but human beings shaped by a fierce environment and a worldview that did not understand monastic life. And upon understanding this, some captives began to see a tragic reflection. They themselves might have acted the same way had they been born there. Years passed and some slaves were freed, others became part of the community, others died nameless. And in that slow and involuntary process, those who came from Lindisfarne became something strange, survivors of two worlds, Christians living among pagans, religious figures who had been forced to forget rituals but never fully managed to erase their faith, captives who had not chosen their fate but who refused to disappear completely into it. In that silent resistance, made of memory, dignity, and a faith reduced to whispers, a new form of identity was born. They were not free, but neither were they totally defeated. And without the Norsemen knowing it, that inner persistence would over time become a seed that would influence the spiritual transformation of the North, long before missionaries arrived armed with crosses and crowns. The prolonged coexistence between Christian captives and Nordic families not only transformed the lives of those who had been torn from Lindisfarne, it also slowly began to shape the spiritual landscape of Scandinavia. It was not a sudden conversion, nor an epic act, as official texts often narrate, but a silent, almost unnoticed process that began in kitchens, in stables, in the long winter nights where fire was the only common language. There, in domestic intimacy, a spiritual tension was born that spanned generations. The friction between two religious worlds that could not ignore each other. For the Vikings, religion was not a rigid set of written rules, but a living network of rituals, stories, and symbols that explained the balance between life and death. Their spirituality was steeped in nature: mountains, rivers, storms, forests. Their gods were warriors, travelers, weavers of fate. The Christian idea of a single, omnipotent, and merciful God seemed at first incomprehensible to a people accustomed to negotiating with spirits and offering sacrifices to ensure their survival. But even so, that worldview began to infiltrate through the most unexpected presences: the slaves. Although they could not preach or celebrate liturgies, the Christian captives inadvertently transmitted their faith. A prayer murmured in the midst of work, a gesture of compassion toward a sick child, a symbol discreetly traced on a piece of wood, a phrase about life after death that slipped out in a moment of vulnerability. All of this, combined with the reflective and disciplined character of many religious figures, caught the attention of some Nordic families. It was not deliberate evangelization, it was simply that true faith, even when battered and reduced to silence, leaves a perceptible mark. For the captives, however, this process was more painful. The tension between their spiritual identity and their physical reality created a wound that never fully closed. The nuns, who previously lived chastity as a sacred act, now saw that virtue reinterpreted within a pagan world, where purity had completely different meanings. The monks, who had been guardians of sacred knowledge, now struggled to remember entire verses while their hands grew exhausted in mechanical tasks. Medieval theology offered contradictory interpretations of these situations. Some theologians insisted that spiritual purity could survive even when the body was profaned by circumstances beyond human control. Others, more strict, considered any violation of the religious order an indelible stain. But for the captives themselves, the most difficult question was much more intimate. What remains of faith when everything sacred has been snatched away? Can a calling survive without a cloister, without liturgy, without community, without freedom? Many of them answered as best they could, by preserving fragments: a psalm learned in childhood, a rite simplified to the bare minimum, a prayer repeated in secret during workdays. These small remnants became a form of inner resistance, a tiny flame that refused to go out. For later Christian chroniclers, those captive religious figures were silent martyrs, not because they died for their faith, but because they lived without being able to fully express it. And yet, a paradox emerged from this forced coexistence. Some Christian slaves inadvertently became cultural bridges. They did not teach doctrine, they taught humanity. Their calm, their discipline, their ability to endure suffering without hatred provoked a new curiosity in some Norsemen. How could these people, torn from their world, continue to believe that mercy held value? How could they maintain a sense of goodness even when no one treated them with kindness? These questions, repeated generation after generation, would slowly begin to erode the foundations of the old paganism. The Icelandic sagas of later centuries mention in a veiled manner women and men of British origin who introduced unknown songs, different stories, and unexpected habits into Nordic homes. Modern archaeology also shows early Christian traces: makeshift crosses, small tablets with symbols foreign to the Norse pantheon, burials that mix pagan and Christian traditions. It is no coincidence. They are remnants of that human clash that was not recorded in the great chronicles, but which transformed the daily lives of thousands of people. However, none of this should be romanticized. Spiritual integration did not erase the suffering. The captives remained slaves. Their influence was that of those who survive in silence, of those who barely leave traces. The Norsemen, who began to take an interest in the Christian faith, did not do so out of compassion for the captives, but out of a complex mix of coexistence, curiosity, and later, political opportunity. But the seed was there, and the seed, sooner or later, germinates. For the nuns and monks torn from Lindisfarne, spiritual inwardness was the last refuge. Although their voices had been silenced, their faith continued to breathe beneath the snow. It did not die. It changed. It became clandestine, intimate, vulnerable. And perhaps because of that, paradoxically, it became more human. In those frozen lands where the night seemed eternal, the Christian faith did not enter with swords or converted kings. It entered with whispers, with tears, with minimal gestures of compassion, and with the silent resistance of those who had lost everything but the hope that God was still listening to them. For centuries, Christian chronicles described the attack on Lindisfarne as if it had been the beginning of the end, a rift that tore through the history of Europe and unleashed a primal fear that no kingdom ever fully managed to control. And in a sense, they were not wrong. The echo of those long ships gliding toward the island in 793 resonated far beyond the monastery. It changed the architecture of fear, the way of praying, the way medieval Europeans understood danger. It even changed the way collective memory constructed the figure of the Viking. In the years following the attack, monasteries all along the coast realized they were no longer untouchable. Their holiness did not protect them from the world. That revelation provoked radical transformations. Hastily built watchtowers, reinforced walls, underground tunnels prepared to hide relics. Liturgical prayers began to include specific supplications. A furore normanorum libera nos, Domine. From the fury of the Northmen deliver us, O Lord. It was not a metaphor. It was a spiritual necessity. Fear had entered the liturgy. Some monasteries were abandoned entirely. The monks retreated inland, carrying relics, manuscripts, and fragments of their cultural identity. In these displacements, the light of knowledge grew dimmer. The production of illuminated manuscripts declined. Entire libraries were lost. Whole generations of copyists saw their work interrupted. The violence did not just destroy buildings, it diverted the intellectual course of Europe. Meanwhile, in the north, the image the Vikings had of themselves did not match what the Christian chronicles described. To them, the attacks were strategic acts, demonstrations of power, opportunities for wealth. But the cultural distance between the two worlds was so profound that each interpreted the same events from completely opposite angles. To the Christians, the Vikings were shadows, humanized demons, messengers of chaos. To the Norsemen, they were explorers, merchants, navigators, warriors. Subsequent history ended up simplifying this complexity. For centuries, the figure of the Viking was trapped between two extremes: the bloodthirsty barbarian of the Christian chronicles and the romantic hero of the Scandinavian sagas. The truth, as always happens, lay between both planes of memory, in a territory where myth and reality mix in proportions that are difficult to separate. Modern historiography, by unearthing tombs, analyzing DNA, and studying archaeological remains, began to reveal a more nuanced picture. The Vikings were capable of terrible violence. Yes, but they were also artisans, farmers, merchants, and colonizers. They built trade routes that connected Europe with Asia, founded cities, and established lasting kingdoms in England, Ireland, Normandy, and Russia. Their legacy is much more complex than what the monastic chronicles left in writing. But that modern reinterpretation must not erase the other side of the story, the suffering of the victims. In a world that tends to romanticize the figure of the warrior, it is easy to forget those who lived the consequences. The monks who died defenseless, the nuns who were torn from their calling, the peasants who lost homes, harvests, and family, the slaves whose names were never preserved, the communities that took decades to rebuild, and above all, the fear, that deep fear that settled into the European psyche for generations. Because if there is one thing that defines the footprint of the Viking attacks, it is not solely the physical destruction, but the emotional fracture they left behind. The medieval Christian world viewed history as a dialogue between God and humanity. Every disaster had a meaning. Every victory was a divine message. Therefore, when the raids became more frequent, many believed that the end of times was beginning. How could God allow sacred places to be profaned? What collective sin justified such punishment? Those questions were not only written in manuscripts, they were engraved into the consciousness of an entire continent. Meanwhile, the Christian captives living in Nordic lands inadvertently became witnesses to two opposing realities. The Europeans saw them as martyrs snatched away by demons of the north, while their captors treated them as necessary cogs in a social machine. Each interpreted them from their own belief system, creating a symbolic gap that still defines our historical view of the period today. The final paradox is unsettling. Modern culture celebrates the Vikings as bold explorers, almost heroic figures, protagonists of television series and interactive museums. But the destroyed monasteries, the burned parchments, the silenced religious voices, and the uprooted lives are still there, in the shadows, reminding us that behind every epic we admire, there is usually a human price we prefer not to look at. Because history, true history, is not only written with the exploits of the victors, but also with the silent echo of those who lost everything. The history of Lindisfarne is usually told from the perspective of major events: the attack, the looting, the fear that spread throughout Europe. But when the echo of the longships faded and the chronicles stopped recording the horror, much smaller, more fragile, more human remnants were left behind. Remnants that do not appear in illuminated manuscripts or heroic sagas, but which form the true heart of this tragedy, the lives of those who disappeared without leaving a name. Because if anything defines this dark chapter of the Viking Age, it is not the ships, nor the weapons, nor the stolen treasures, but the silence, a deep, almost sacred silence that fell upon those who never returned. The nuns who had been torn from their communities, the monks who never again heard the monastery bells, the young people who became anonymous hands working in foreign lands, the families on the English coast who waited for news that never arrived. That silence, more than any chronicle, is the truest footprint of the attack. When we visit the ruins of Lindisfarne today, we see eroded stones, incomplete walls, broken arches pointing toward a sky that no longer hears the Gregorian chants of yesteryear. But those ruins are not just architectural relics, they are nameless epitaphs. Every worn stone is an untold story, an interrupted life, a prayer that hung suspended in the air, unable to be completed. In Norse records, the names of the captives almost never appear. They were thrall, property, tools. They were given no genealogy, no memory, no voice. But in the Christian world, the absence of those names became a wound that later generations tried to heal with stories, hymns, and prayers. Some monks wrote about them as invisible martyrs. Others collected fragmented testimonies, descriptions, rumors, small legends about nuns who kept their faith in secret or monks who taught the Latin alphabet to their master's children. Tiny, almost imperceptible stories, but enough to remind us that even in the most silent slavery, a spark of humanity can survive. Modern archaeology has found humble graves, small objects, marks in the earth that reveal clues of that Christian presence in Nordic lands. A cross carved into a piece of wood, an incomplete inscription mixing runes with Christian symbols, pagan amulets found alongside fragments of prayers. All of this points to something historians are beginning to understand. The memory of the captives did not disappear entirely. It lived on in gestures, in objects, in silences that time could not completely erase. And yet the most moving thing is not what they left behind, but what they could not keep: their names, their voices, their complete stories. No chronicle tells us what the last nun thought as the ship sailed away from the English coast. No manuscript records a monk's first night on a Norse farm, looking at the sky and wondering if God was still listening to him from so far away. They are questions that will never have an answer, but they remain alive precisely because no one wrote them down. The mystery of the unspoken is sometimes the greatest monument to a lost life. In the history of civilizations, we tend to remember the conquerors, the kings, the warriors, but the true moral weight of the past is borne by those who did not choose their fate. The captives of Lindisfarne did not want to be part of the Viking Age. They were dragged into it. And their silence, that silence that not even the north wind could erase, is a reminder that every historical advance, every cultural expansion, every epic episode has a hidden human cost that we rarely confess. When we walk through the ruins of the monastery, the wind blowing through the stones sounds like a whisper. It is easy to imagine that those cold drafts are not simple natural phenomena, but the voices of those who could not return. voices that seek neither revenge nor glory, but something simpler, to be remembered. Because in the end, the true legacy of Lindisfarne was not Viking violence, nor the fear that marked an entire era. Its deepest legacy is the memory of those who disappeared without anyone protecting their stories. An eternal reminder that silence is also history, and that the forgotten, even if they are not in the books, continue to inhabit every stone and every stillness of the places where they once lived.